As both parties start mapping out their strategies for midterms and 2024, we're seeing the divide between the most and least populated counties in America continue to grow. The Hill's analysis of new data from the Census Bureau reveals that Joe Biden won 91 of the 100 largest counties, while Donald Trump carried 95% of the 100 counties with the smallest populations. The Hill's Reid Wilson also notes that Trump became the first Republican presidential nominee in more than 30 years to earn more than 1.1 million votes in Los Angeles County, attracting more than 375,000 new voters in the blue state. Although 2020 made Trump the most voted for Republican presidential candidate in history, he still trailed Biden, who earned more votes than any candidate to ever run for president, regardless of party. Correspondent for The Hill, Reid Wilson, joins us now to discuss this data. Reid, great to have you.
Hey.
So tell us more about this. This is fascinating. What does this tell us about how the country's changing, demographic shifts, and what does it mean for 2022 and 2024?
So basically, since the beginning of the Republic, since the very first census, what we've seen over time is more and more Americans are living in urban centers and rural America is shrinking. That happened again in this census. More than 86% of Americans now live in an urban core, and the percentage of Americans who live in rural areas shrank by about 2 points over the last decade. What is new, though, is the sort of political realignment of rural areas and urban areas. You know, 20, 30, 40 years ago, Democrats gained significant numbers of votes in rural areas. Republicans did in urban areas. That's not the case anymore. As we look at some of these big counties now, overwhelmingly, Democrats win the largest counties in America, and Republicans are winning more and more of the smallest counties. Now, why that matters in the future is because the urban areas are growing and those smaller areas are shrinking. So, you know, rural America is losing population. Republicans are getting a larger and larger chunk out of basically a shrinking population. The numbers, though, that you mentioned, especially in a place like Los Angeles County, show what I think is a pretty interesting new trend here, is that Donald Trump did, in fact, gain a lot of new votes. You know, his whole campaign's philosophy was, we're going to drive out voters who don't vote regularly, who've never voted before. I was a little skeptical of that, but they went and actually found those voters and drove them out. Now, the difference is Joe Biden went out and found more voters who hadn't voted or rarely voted. So when you talk about Los Angeles County, Trump gaining 370,000 new votes, that's great, but for the fact that Joe Biden gained 500,000 new votes over Hillary Clinton. So in these largest counties, again and again, we saw Trump improve on his performance from 2016, but Biden doing even better than Hillary Clinton did in 2016.
Now, it happened too late to get picked up in this census, but what effect do you think people's ability to work from home and thereby leave some of these metro areas and go to some of these lower cost rural areas is going to have? Is it going to be such a trickle that it doesn't wind up kind of showing up in any races? Or do you think you could have enough people going from blue states into rural areas and with a declining rural population that it could actually start to matter?
So at the beginning of the pandemic, one of the things that we talked about a lot was this sort of flight from the city to other areas. And I think we sort of shorthanded that as rural America. But that's not really what's happening. The data that we've seen in just the last year, it didn't make it into the census, but it has made it into subsequent reviews and data that comes from, you know, the realtors or the home builders or places, people like that. Who keep track on sort of a more month by month basis. What we did see is basically everybody's looking for one size upgrade in their house. If you live in a city in a townhouse like the one I'm sitting in right now, you're probably thinking about moving to the suburbs, not to a rural area with, you know, a massive yard, but to someplace a little bit bigger. If you live in an apartment, you're probably looking to buy in a townhouse, which, by the way, is why the housing markets in a lot of these big cities are suddenly so tight, is there are a lot of new buyers and not a lot of people who are actually thinking about moving. The flight from cities has sort of slowed in recent years. It was a big thing early on in the decade. In fact, we saw a place like Cook County, Chicago, losing population over the last couple of years. So has New York City. But those people, they're not moving to small town Iowa or small town Wisconsin. They're moving just outside the city. So basically, I think what we're going to see is people are going to want to stay in the office a couple of days a week, have the option to get there by a train or a long drive or something like that. They're not going to want to move a plane flight away from where their office is.
So you talked about these new voters that Trump found and Biden found even more of. And I'm curious, among these, did they generally vote party line? So, if it's the 300 some odd thousand that came out for Trump in LA County, did they then vote down ballot with just general Republicans? How did that break down?
Yeah, so in a lot of cases, we saw a more homogenous ballot this year than we ever have before. What do I mean by homogenous? When people vote, there are typically at least a few people who will vote for a Republican president and a Democratic governor nominee and a Libertarian city council nominee or whatever. More and more, though, people are voting a straight ticket. So if you start voting R or D at the top of the ticket, you're probably going all the way down the ticket that way. There are only something like 16 members of the House of Representatives who represent districts that the other party's presidential candidate carried. People like Ron Kind in Wisconsin, Sherry Bustos in Illinois. I think there were a couple of Republicans up in New York. I got the full list somewhere. But more and more, people just vote that sort of straight ticket line. There are, what do we have? One Republican senator who won a state that Joe Biden won, and that was Susan Collins up in Maine. So I think we tend to see these new voters sticking with a party line, which is an indication that our politics are becoming more and more polarized. There are fewer and fewer, liberal Northeastern Republicans or conservative blue dog Democrats in Congress or even in the electorate itself. And that tells you that more and more, like when I was a kid growing up, I always used to say that a Democrat from Alabama was much more conservative than a Democrat from my home state of Washington. Nowadays, they pretty much vote the same way.
So given the structural disadvantages that Democrats have nationally, in the Electoral College, in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, and combining that with this trend where you have more and more people moving to urban and suburban areas and fewer people in rural areas, at what point do Democrats have to kind of get to outweigh the structural disadvantage that they have? I mean, what numbers do they need to start picking up nationally in order to not get swamped by those disadvantages, and how far away are they from that if these trends continue at the pace you're seeing?
Well, the big thing that we've seen, look, the suburbs are where elections are won and lost, and the suburbs are sufficiently large now that they can outweigh Republican votes in rural areas. What Democrats need to do is they need to win the suburbs, not by a little, but by a lot. Because a lot of those suburban districts also include rural areas, whereas urban cores, if you were to draw districts that equally divided, a big city and put them with rural areas, you'd have a map that looked like pie slices, and no judge is going to uphold a map like that. So more and more Democrats need to win by significant numbers in suburban areas. That's how they win the House. That's how, and if we talk about exact numbers, on a state by state basis, it's all totally different. In a state like Oregon, there are substantial numbers of Democratic voters, even in rural areas. They're sort of ancestral Democrats because they're all sort of old, timber labor voters. That state, the State House of Representatives, is considering a redistricting proposal right now that would divide the state's 6 districts in what's probably going to be a 5-to-1 Democratic split. Now, you can't have that same split in a state like Wisconsin, where there are a ton of conservative voters who are ringing the two sort of liberal enclaves of Milwaukee and Madison. That state has a 5-to-3 Republican split right now, and that may change to a 6-to-2 split now that Ron Kind is leaving his district, again, one of those districts that voted for President Trump in 2020.
Very fascinating. Let me ask you this: is there any breakdown in rural America when you're talking about different parts of the country? So whether it's northern rural versus southern, or does it tend to just be broad strokes? Because looking at the numbers in your reporting, it seems that it's just broad strokes, regardless of geographically where you are, that they tend to lean Republican. Is that largely the case?
No, there are enclaves here and there that are different, and this is why the census numbers are so fascinating. Like, they tell the story behind America, behind who we are, and they get to exactly those nuances. So there's a broad swath of America, of these rural counties that are losing population. And of the counties that lost the largest share of population over the last decade, Donald Trump won 65. The 35 counties that Joe Biden won they're all rural, they're all losing population. But what are they? They're all in the Deep South. They're all heavily African American. They're in a big sort of farming area where African Americans have lived and dominated the population for 200 years. Anyway, there's a difference there, right? Biden does well in this big swath of rural America that swings from, South Carolina into Georgia through Mississippi and Alabama and into Louisiana and even parts of Texas. There are other rural areas where Trump did surprisingly well in counties that Hillary Clinton won, and those are all areas along the Rio Grande Valley. So hugely Hispanic population that really turned out to vote for Trump. Again, I mentioned those the counties along the Pacific coast that are all former timber counties. They were Democratic for a long time, basically back to the Roosevelt era. Now they're changing over just the last 10 or 12 years. They've started to flip towards Republicans. Basically, any county north of the California-Oregon border is much more likely to vote for President Trump than for any Republican in prior years, even as the liberal enclaves, the Portlands, the Seattles, vote heavier and heavier for Joe Biden.
Right. Interesting stuff. Thanks for joining us, Reid.
You got it.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.